certainly a pleasure to be here and talk a little bit about this. We do, as you can imagine, have any number of international trade challenges, and not just salmonella, but I think certainly we see a lot of differences around the world in how countries deal with salmonella. And when we look internationally and start at the 40,000-foot level, really there's differences around the world in what constitutes a risk and this idea of what constitutes a risk. And I think that leads to a lot of differences in how different countries approach things, and differences in leading to some of the disagreements that we see in international trade. There's differences in methodologies for testing, for lab methods, procedures, detection limits, things like that. I think it really leads us to wonder, from our standpoint in the U.S., what we can do to address these issues. There's philosophical differences, and fundamentally there's two different methods of control. In the U.S., we tend to use a process control where we identify and try to manage the risks, the foodborne risks. We develop procedures to try to minimize those risks, and then we verify to make sure that those procedures that we put in place are actually accomplishing what we set out to do. In many other countries, though, they use a system that's typically called command and control, where they set standards and then they do testing, and if you're found to be out of compliance, then there's sanctions against the producers to try to bring them back into compliance. Those are the two main differences. There's also this animal called the precautionary principle that we see. It's in some cases, primarily in Europe, it's used, and that is a much different philosophy and leads to quite different things, different MRLs. We see sanctions and concern about genetically modified organisms, about cloning, about hormones, just about anything you can imagine. And those are the fundamental things that really lead to differences across countries when we try to export products around the world. In the U.S., we generally consider that there is no such thing as zero risk, and so what we do is we try to reduce those risks as much as possible. With the exception in the U.S., we do have zero tolerance on things like E. coli 015787 in ground beef, and also listeria in ready-to-eat products. Internationally, though, many countries have a zero tolerance standard on fresh and frozen imported meat products, and in addition, frequently we see that there's no real transparency in their inspection and sampling procedures and their testing methodologies. A good example recently and for some time is China and Russia. Many difficulties in working with those current systems. Frequently we see, the WTO has, essentially WTO rules require that you can't have different rules for imports, different, more substantial requirements for imports than you do for your own domestic production. But often, due to that lack of transparency in many of these countries, they will claim to have a zero tolerance domestically, but the question is, how do you go ahead and confirm that? And I think here's a picture of in Vietnam of what I guess you'd call a Vietnamese slaughter facility. And you can just take a look at that. I think the pig hanging on the scooter that's the delivery mechanism to the marketplace. So I think you'd have to wonder how they are accomplishing this zero tolerance on salmonella in a situation like this. The U.S. has performance standards that are based on carcass sampling, but the Chinese claim, on the other hand, that they consume a lot of offals, and we do ship a lot of variety meats to China, but the U.S. doesn't monitor those offals, and we don't apply a lot of interventions there, and so that also leads to conflicts, I think, with China specifically. So the U.S. has standards for domestic production, and they utilize these performance standards to identify a specific goal, and then they break those facilities down into different categories. I think Dr. Wagstrom cited those pretty extensively in her talk. And then the facilities have to make efforts to improve and so they can advance to better categories, and they also have to work to maintain their status in that high category. There's an example here of the performance standards. This is a sampling done over about a 10-year period here, and I think you can see that generally speaking, the poultry industry, in the case of Salmonella, has a higher percentage of positive samples than the swine industry, and the beef industry. Cattle tend to be pretty low. On ground products, it appears that when we grind and mix up things, it tends to, as expected, I think, increases the percentage findings across all species. But there is a pretty good standard. We have made improvements. I think in 2008 we had 86% of our hog market establishments in the number one category, up from 69% in 2007. And there has been substantial improvements in this over the years. If we take a look, just as a comparison, at some of our competition around the world, Denmark, a major pork exporter, since 1995, they've had a nationwide control program for Salmonella in place. They have a large pre-harvest component on farm, and they utilize a monetary punishment system, I guess, to help move their producers to a higher level. And this is kind of a set standard of what the penalties are for sales price on or the slaughter value of the pigs coming out of the different categories. So there's definitely an incentive to move your farm to the level one. It's been actually fairly. They have had some successes. Salmonella has been reduced from about 3 to 4%. Finding on carcasses back in 1993 to about 1% today. Actually, it's probably been a little better improvement than that, because about 2001, I think they changed their sampling methods, which actually increased the findings, and so the old sampling method probably was understating their findings relative to what the testing would be today. But there are some costs involved, definitely. The CDC claims that the cost of this program is about 16 cents per pound of pork, so it is not insignificant. Also, Scott Hurd in 2008 did a study and looked at their system there, and I think generally they found that there were definite advantages from the improvements from the on-farm interventions in the early years, but they appear to have actually leveled out with their current methods and technologies. And without some significant change, probably won't see much improvement in the future from on-farm interventions. There has been greater and more cost-effective improvements from the plant interventions, and their study determined that actually there were the most opportunity for future improvement would probably come from some kind of carcass sterilization or washes, which are actually, my understanding, are prohibited at this point. And this graph just kind of looks across several products, I guess, the improvements that they have made over the years. There was a peak in pork human cases of Salmonella Noses identified and traced back to pork back in 1993, which led to the startup of the pork program, which was fully implemented by 1995. And you can see that there were some improvements. The Danes don't use this program or this information in any direct sales efforts around the world, but certainly on the scientific level it's touted and does lend confidence to the Danish system. The U.S. import standards, the U.S. applies these similar standards to imports as we do domestically, and so we do surveil imports into the U.S. for 157H7 and ground beef. and Salmonella, E. coli, and Listeria on imported ready-to-eat products. Many people are kind of surprised to see that we don't sample raw products for Salmonella that are imported. Again, it's a system based on our domestic, on what we do domestically. It's based on performance standards, and so the U.S. does conduct audits of plants that are approved to import into the U.S. And those audits, in those audits, they need to demonstrate conformity with performance standards. Here's some examples of countries around the world and their standards. The countries listed on the left, and then their standard on the right. With China, it's a zero tolerance, and it's not a very open process, so there's not really a lot known about it. In Japan, for example, the product must test negative on a 25-gram sample, and it lists a number of the similar things for other countries. Usually, we've not had a problem meeting these standards, with the exception of Russia and China. In those countries, it seems like we've had more options or more obstacles to overcome, and in addition, sometimes it's not just the finding of a positive sample that's the real issue; it's the action taken. And in Russia and China, what these lead to is a delisting of the plant, and then they can no longer ship product to those countries. So it's a pretty severe penalty. Here's some additional. Some more examples around the world. I guess one recent success story is the country of Vietnam, listed at the bottom. Vietnam had maintained a zero tolerance for salmonella and a lot of other standards which were really impossible to meet. But recently, they notified the WTO of some significant changes in their standards. And now, primarily, their MRLs, or their maximum residue limits, are now in line with the Codex International standards, and they actually now have a tolerance for Salmonella that's readily attainable. And this was actually brought about by an organization called the Food and Agriculture Export Alliance, which the USMEF is a part of and helps fund. But they did a project over the last 3 years in Vietnam to help them essentially with capacity building to set up their system for food safety. And it ended up in a system that's much more closely aligned to the U.S. system, so we think that'll be a big benefit in years to come. In other countries, in South Korea, for example, they utilize the same performance standards as the U.S. Obviously, then this makes for a system that's much easier to manage for U.S. countries that are exporting into South Korea. Here's an example of a report from China that we get periodically, and there's a couple of sightings of finding of Salmonella typhimurian, positive findings in a couple of different samples there. But this is all you get. There's no other information. There's no access to any of the methodologies that are used, and there's no access to the actual test results. And frequently these findings lead to delisting of plants, stops their ability to export any products there, and so the penalties can be pretty severe. Here's another example. This is a list maintained by USDA and the U.S. Meat Export Federation. Is specific to China, and here's listing a couple of examples of finding of Salmonella in some frozen swine kidneys, and then the resulting action is that the plants were suspended. At one point in time, the U.S. had 11 pork establishments and over 15 poultry establishments that were suspended from exporting to China. And at the moment, there are 7 establishments, pork establishments, and 4 poultry establishments that are suspended. This is aside from the current bans in China for H1N1 for pork and the recently imposed anti-dumping duties on poultry. This is from Russia. Russia is not a WTO member, but they have all kinds of requirements, testing requirements for pesticides, antibiotics, microbiological testing requirements, parasites, and I think radionuclides, which I guess they want to know if any of the product was transported anywhere near Chernobyl or something. I think they have said that they have not found any problems with radioactive materials in U.S. pork, so that's a good thing. But the standard, the sample and the finding of this particular sample is listed on the right, and then the standard is in the next column over to the left. Quite a list of things that they test for frequently and can cause problems for U.S. exporters. I think one of the speakers yesterday commented about the fact that the WTO has been successful in reducing tariffs around the world, but I think what you've seen is as the number of tariffs has declined, the number of non-tariff barriers has increased correspondingly, and so frequently countries use these sanitary and phytosanitary issues to essentially accomplish what they used to do with tariffs. So that's very common. We see that all over the world. In addition, Russia, as an example, has made no secret about their intention to expand their own domestic pork and poultry industries, and so we'll see. I think we'll see more of this in the future. They will attempt to limit imports of those products just to protect their own domestic industries. We do have a new Russian export verification program that was just recently implemented March 11th, so it is pretty new. It's really an attempt to meet the Russians on a scientific level, I guess, and try to make some attempt to meet their standards, which I guess we question a lot whether they're really based on science, but they do have these standards, and so there has been some attempt to put in place an export verification program that would attempt to do that. Specific to Salmonella, there are testing requirements, a 25-gram sample from deep muscle tissue. They have to sample one sample per production day that's going to be used in the Russian exports, and then the companies would provide those test results to FSIS. And then there's procedures. If the sample tests positive, there's further testing requirements. And then if any of the additional samples would test positive, then that specific product is not eligible for export to Russia. So with all that, I think it begs the question as to how we make progress. And I guess really it's not a revolutionary thing. It's something that evolves. We need to continue to make improvements in the U.S. Domestic mitigation procedures. Anything we can do to improve the value of our product is going to be helpful in exporting our products internationally. We need to continue to work closely with international organizations like Codex to make sure that the standards that they have are attainable. We need to continue to work with our trading partners and try to put in place better standards that are more transparent and attainable. Vietnam is a good example of a success in that area, and certainly our competitors in Canada, Australia, especially in the EU, are very, very active in this area. The EU surprisingly makes substantial effort in that area, and you see some really, I think, things that we see quite strange, I guess. The fact that in most of the African continent, the fact that genetically modified organisms are prohibited from production there is really thanks to the employment of the EU and their precautionary principle being adapted in Africa. So also, I think we can continue to develop transparency and sampling and methodologies, and continue to work harder to create relationships with countries like Russia and China, there still are rewards to be had by improving those relationships. So